Every Friday evening, without fail, he came to the post office just before closing. Winifred Colborne noticed it the third time it happened. She had not meant to keep track. She was new to Harlow, new to the postmistress position that Mrs. Agnes Pruitt had vacated after her husband's stroke, and she was still learning the rhythms of the place. Which families were expecting letters from back east, which farmers preferred their parcels left on the side step rather than held behind the counter. There was a great deal to learn, and she had not come to Harlow with the luxury of time to waste on idle noticing. But some things made themselves noticed regardless. He always arrived at 20 minutes to 5. She could not have said how she knew this without looking at the clock, only that she had come to feel the slight shift in the air that preceded him. The way the late afternoon light fell differently through the window just before the door opened. He was tall enough that the frame seemed to shrink around him when he stepped through. His hat came off the moment he was inside, held against his chest with both hands, and he would stand there for a moment before approaching the counter, as though reminding himself of something. His name was Jasper Holt. She knew this from the correspondence she sorted each week. Letters addressed to J. Holt, Rural Route 4, Harlow, Saskatchewan. Occasionally a bill from the feed supplier in Moosemockjaw. Once, a letter in a woman's handwriting that he held for a long time before tucking into his coat pocket without opening. He never explained himself. He simply asked whether there was anything for Holt, Route 4, and she would check the sorted cubbies, and there was usually something, sometimes not. And he would nod his thanks and turn to go. The entire transaction lasted perhaps 2 minutes, and yet she found herself, every Thursday evening, making certain the Friday sorting was done with particular care. She told herself it was professionalism. Winifred Colborne had come to Harlow in the autumn of 1911 with $23, a steamer trunk, and the kind of quietness that settles into a person after they have grieved alone for long enough. She was 28 years old. Her mother had died in the spring. A long illness, the slow kind that consumes both the patient and the caretaker equally, leaving the survivor hollowed out and blinking in the sudden absence of obligation. There had been a brother once, Edmund, but Edmund had gone west 3 years earlier and had written twice, and then not again. There was a cousin in Regina who had mentioned, without particular warmth, that the Harlow postmistress position was going vacant if Winifred was looking. She had been looking. The town of Harlow was small enough that a newcomer was not invisible for long. The general store was run by Mr. and Mrs. Drummond, a couple of formidable practicality who seemed to know everything that moved through the town and some things that didn't. The minister, Reverend Bryce, had called on her in her second week with a plate of shortbread and a gentle interrogation that he disguised as welcome. The women of the Ladies' Aid had included her at their November supper, and she had sat between a forthright widow named Mrs. Hargreave and a young woman called Bertie Foss, who farmed with her father and spoke with the directness of someone who had never had much patience for indirection. Through all of them, in various ways, she had learned something of Jasper Holt. He had come to the district 12 years ago, from somewhere further north that no one seemed to know precisely. He had built his place on the east quarter of the Holt land, 4 miles out of town, and had farmed it since. He kept cattle mainly. He was known to be a fair man to deal with and a reliable neighbor, in the way that mattered on the prairie. The kind who appeared without being asked when someone's fence line went down in a storm, who helped with the harvest without requiring the favor be tallied. He had been married. His wife, Constance, had died 6 years ago of a fever that came on in February and did not leave. There were no children. Mrs. Hargreave had told her this last part with a kind of weighted meaning that Winifred pretended not to notice. "He is not a sociable man," Mrs. Hargreave had added, "but he is a good one. There is a difference, and not everyone understands it." Winifred had thought about that for several days afterward. Winter came to Saskatchewan the way it always did, not as a gradual cooling but as a sudden and absolute declaration. By December, the temperature had dropped in a single night to something that made the air seem solid. And the road between Harlow and the rural routes became a matter of genuine consideration, rather than simple preference. Several of the outlying families reduced their trips to town to once a fortnight. The mail delivery that usually went out by buggy along Route 4 was suspended until the roads were broken again after a heavy snowfall. Which meant that, for 3 consecutive Fridays, Jasper Holt did not come to the post office. Winifred told herself she had not noticed his absence. This was untrue. She sorted his mail into the cubby the same as always. A bill from the feed supplier, a government circular, a seed catalog from a company in Ontario. Small evidence of a life continuing to conduct its ordinary business, regardless of whether its conductor was present to acknowledge it. On the 4th Friday, at 20 minutes to 5, the door opened. The cold came in with him like a third presence. His coat was the heavy canvas kind. The collar turned up, and he moved with the particular stiffness of someone who had driven a long distance in weather that had no interest in his comfort. He removed his hat, and for a moment he stood without speaking, his eyes adjusting to the warmth of the room. "Miss Colborne," he said. It was the first time he had used her name, rather than simply addressing his question to her as the general representative of the Postal Service. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I've been holding several pieces for you. The roads have been difficult." "They have." She retrieved the small stack from the cubby and brought it to the counter. He took it from her hands, carefully, so that their fingers did not touch, though the counter between them was narrow, and looked through the pieces one by one. His hands were rough in the way of a man who worked in all weather. The skin cracked at the knuckles, a pale scar running along the base of his left thumb. "The seed catalog came last week," she said, because the silence felt like something that needed acknowledging rather than simply occupying. "I wasn't sure if it would still be useful." "Still deciding," he said, without looking up. "The South field did poorly this year. Thinking of trying a different grain." "What did you have in it?" He looked up then. It seemed to slightly surprise him, the question, not that it had been asked, but that she had followed the thread of the conversation with genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "Winter wheat," he said. 3 years running. The drainage is wrong for it. My father had the same difficulty. He had a parcel of low ground in the river flat that flooded in the spring melt and baked dry by July. He finally gave it over to hay entirely and said at least it was honest about what it was. Jasper Holt looked at her for a moment. "That's a sensible way to think about it," he said. He tucked the mail into his coat pocket and put his hat back on. "Thank you, Miss Colborne, for keeping these." "Of course, Mr. Holt. That's what we're here for." He nodded and went out, and the cold came back in briefly, and then the door closed. Winifred stood at the counter for a moment after he had gone, aware that she was standing there and not entirely sure why. She had learned a small thing about him. He was still dissiding about the South Field. A rider emerged from the gloom. She did not know why this should feel like anything at all, and yet it sat with her through the rest of the afternoon, with the particular quality of something that would be thought about again. The Ladies' Aid Winter Social was held the second Saturday of December, in the church basement, and attendance was considered less optional than most polite invitations in Harlow. Winifred went, and was glad she had. The room was warm and smelled of pine boughs and the particular kind of cinnamon cake that Mrs. Drummond made only at Christmas, and, for the first time since arriving, she felt something that was not quite loneliness, which was as close to belonging as she had managed yet. Bertie Foss arrived late, with snow still in her hair, and folded herself into a chair next to Winifred, with the ease of someone who did not much care whether her entrance had been observed. "I saw Jasper Holt's rig outside the hardware when I came through," Bertie said, helping herself to a piece of cake. "He rarely comes twice in a week in winter." "Does he not?" Winifred said, in the tone of someone who was asking a neutral question. Bertie had a way of looking at a person sideways that was more perceptive than any direct stare. "He came to the post office yesterday." "He did. First time in nearly a month, I'd imagine. The roads have been difficult." "Yes," Bertie said. "They have." She was quiet for a moment, eating her cake with the satisfaction of someone who had said what she intended to say and was content to let it settle. Winifred chose not to examine too closely what was being suggested. But, in the new year, she began to notice other things. He had begun to come inside the general store on the Fridays he came to town, rather than collecting his goods from the list he left with Drummond and waiting in the yard. Small purchases, a spool of wire, a tin of linseed oil, nothing that required lengthy deliberation. The store was 3 doors down from the post office. He sometimes passed the post office window on his way back to his wagon, and once he glanced in, and she was at the counter sorting, and their eyes met through the glass for a moment before she looked back down at the envelopes in her hand. She told herself that meant nothing. People glanced through windows. It was simply what eyes did. In February, a letter came for him from Lethbridge, Alberta. A different hand than the one she had seen before, this time a man's writing, confident and slanted. She placed it with his other mail in the usual way, and thought nothing further about it until he came on Friday, and upon seeing it in the small stack, said quietly, "Ah, my brother. I didn't know you had family in Alberta," she said, and then wondered if that was too much, if it revealed that she had thought about his correspondence rather than simply handling them as pieces of mail. "Half-brother," he said. "We don't write often. He remarried last year, has a new daughter." He paused, looking at the envelope. "He wants me to come for a visit in the spring. Will you?" He considered the envelope for a long moment. "It's a long way," he said, "and spring is a busy time." She understood from this that he would not go, and she understood something further, that spring being busy was not entirely the reason, and that he knew this himself. There was a loneliness in the way he held the letter that she recognized with the particular clarity of someone who had felt the same thing. "It was kind of him to write," she said. It was. He put the letter in his pocket. "He's a better man than I give him credit for, I think." After he left, she thought about what it meant that he had said that to her, that he had offered that small, unguarded admission to a woman who handed him his mail on Friday afternoons. She did not think he was the kind of man who said such things easily. She did not think he said them to many people at all. March announced itself with a week of wind that came down from the north and stripped whatever warmth the February sun had managed to suggest. The roads that had begun to soften turned back to iron. Winifred caught a cold that she worked through, because there was no one to manage the post office in her absence, and she had not yet been in Harlow long enough to feel entitled to disruption. On the Friday that she was at her worst, head heavy, eyes dry, moving through the afternoon by determination alone, Jasper Holt came at his usual time. He stopped just inside the door, as he always did. Then he looked at her, and something shifted slightly in his expression. Nothing dramatic, just the small adjustment of a man who has registered something he had not expected. "You're unwell," he said. "I'm managing," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the counter, took his mail, and turned to go. She thought that was the end of it. He paused at the door. "There's a woman in town, Mrs. Croft on Railway Street. She makes a broth with wild onion that my wife swore by." He stopped. The word wife seemed to cost him something, and he was still for just a moment before continuing, "For a cold, if you haven't someone to bring you things." "I don't," she said. "Have someone, but thank you." He nodded and went out. The following Monday, there was a jar on the step of the post office when she arrived to open. The label said nothing, only had a small pencil notation. WC. Her initials. The broth was pale gold and smelled of onion, and something else she couldn't name. Something warm and grassy. She heated it on the small stove in the back room during her noon hour, and drank it sitting on the stool by the sorting table. By Wednesday she was better. She kept the jar. She had not intended to keep the jar. April came. The fields around Harlow turned from brown to the tentative green of early growth, and the mood of the town lifted the way it always did when the ground softened and the days lengthened, and the year became a thing that could be reckoned with again. Winifred had been in Harlow 8 months. She had stopped thinking of herself as new. It was Bertie Foss who told her, as they walked back from the post office one Thursday noon hour, that another man had been asking after her. "Cecil Payne," Bertie said. "He farms the north section of the Payne land, his father's place. He's been a widower 3 years. Good enough man, a bit of a talker." Winifred said nothing. "He mentioned to my father that he might call," Bertie continued, in the tone of someone delivering information with careful neutrality. "He's welcome to call," Winifred said. "I can't prevent anyone from calling." "No," Bertie agreed. "You can't." They walked in silence for a moment. "He's coming to the spring dance next week," Bertie said. "He mentioned he hoped you would be there." Winifred was there. The spring dance was held in the community hall, which had been swept and strung with lanterns for the occasion. And the fiddler from 2 communities over had been engaged, and by 8 o'clock the floor was full and warm, and the mood was the particular generous kind that comes when winter has genuinely ended and everyone has survived it. Cecil Payne did find her, and he was as Bertie had described. Good enough, and a talker. He was pleasant and attentive, and she danced 2 dances with him and felt, at the end of them, nothing in particular. This was not his fault. She was aware it was not his fault. She had not expected to see Jasper Holt at the dance. She was not certain he was the kind of man who attended dances. She saw him near the door, talking with 2 other men she recognized from the post office regulars, farmers, both of them. He had a tin cup in one hand. He had not dressed differently for the evening exactly, but his shirt was clean and pressed in a way that suggested the occasion had been acknowledged. He was not dancing. She became aware over the course of the next half hour that he was aware of where she was in the room. It was not obvious. He did not stare, but twice when she looked in his direction, he was already looking slightly away. And once, when Cecil Payne took her hand to lead her into the next set, she caught the moment of stillness that passed over Jasper Holt's expression before he returned to his conversation. She thought about that stillness for the rest of the evening. She danced no more dances with Cecil Payne. This was not a decision she made consciously. It was simply that the evening arranged itself differently after that. And she ended up standing near the refreshments table with Bertie's father and 2 of the older women from the Ladies' Aid, and the fiddler played through his last set, and the evening ended. As people were gathering coats and filing out, she found herself near the door at the same moment as Jasper Holt. She was not sure how this had happened. She was not sure she had not allowed it to happen. "Good evening, Mr. Holt," she said. "I didn't know you came to these." "Occasionally," he said. He was looking at her, in a way that was different from the post office. There was more of it, the looking, as though the context had removed some of the ordinary restraint. And do you enjoy them? He seemed to consider this seriously, rather than offering the automatic answer. More than I expected to, he said. This time. She put on her coat. He did not offer to help, but he waited. Simply stood there while she arranged her buttons in a way that had the quality of a company without presuming it. They went out together into the cool April night, and he walked with her to the corner of Railway and Main without either of them having agreed to this, and at the corner he stopped. "Good night, Miss Colborne," he said. "Good night, Mr. Holt." He stood there while she walked the rest of the way to her rooms above the hardware. She did not look back, but she heard him standing there, or rather, she did not hear him walk away, which amounted to the same thing. She stood at her window for a while before she lit the lamp. The next Friday he came at his usual time. He collected his mail. He put it in his pocket. Then, instead of turning to go, he stood for a moment looking at the surface of the counter. "Miss Colborne," he said, "I wonder if you would walk with me after you've closed on Sunday." The post office closed at noon on Sundays. She had been spending those afternoons reading, mostly, or writing letters that she did not have enough correspondence to fully justify. "Along the creek road if the weather holds," he added, as though location were the part that required specification. "That would be very pleasant, Mr. Holt," she said. He nodded. He put on his hat. "Sunday then," he said, and went out. She waited until the door had fully closed before she allowed herself to let out the breath she had been holding. The weather held. He was waiting outside the post office when she locked up at noon. Standing by a small buckboard, his hat in his hands, and he had brought a horse she hadn't seen before, a gray mare of obvious temperament who was spending her waiting time expressing opinions about a mud puddle to her left. The sight of this, the serious man and the opinionated horse, made Winifred smile before she had thought not to. "She's called Hester," Jasper said, with a tone that suggested Hester had strong feelings about the name as well. "We'll get along," Winifred said, and went to put her hand to the mare's nose, and Hester blew a considering breath and then accepted the situation. They walked rather than drove, following the creek road south of town, where the willows were just beginning to come into their spring green. He walked with the measured pace of a man, accustomed to covering ground without hurrying it. She matched him, without difficulty. The creek ran high from the melt, carrying its cold brown water, with a steady voice that filled the silences. The silences were not uncomfortable. This surprised her slightly, and she thought about why, and decided it was because she had come to understand, over the months of 2-minute Friday conversations, that his silences were not withdrawals, but simply the way he moved through thought. He did not say things until he was ready to say them. This turned out to be something she trusted. "The south field," he said, eventually. "I decided on oats, and the drainage. I'm digging it out this spring. My neighbor Whitmore is lending me the equipment." He was quiet for a few steps. "Your father's way of thinking about it was useful. The honest about what it is." "I'm glad," she said. "It's a good way to think about most things, I find." She looked at the creek rather than at him. "My father was better with land than with most other things," she said. He knew how to wait and how to accept. He was not always as good at those things in other areas of his life. "Most people aren't," Jasper said. "It comes easier with land because the land doesn't take it personally." She laughed briefly and genuinely, and he turned to look at her, with an expression she could not entirely read, but that was not unpleasant to be on the receiving end of. They walked to the old Ellerly Bridge and stood looking at the water for a while, and then turned back, without any particular discussion of turning back. Because, The walk home seemed the right thing to do next. She told him about Edmund, her brother, the one who had stopped writing, and he listened without offering advice, which she appreciated greatly. She told him about the 8 months in their house after her mother became ill, the way the days had a strange quality of being very full and very empty at the same time. He was quiet for a moment after she said this. The first year after Constance, he said, slowly, as though choosing words with care, the house felt like a coat that didn't fit anymore. Everything in it was the right size and the right place, and none of it was right. Yes, she said, exactly that. They walked in silence for a while, and it was a different kind of silence than before. The kind that comes after something true has been said and doesn't need to be added to. At the corner of Railway and Main, he stopped again, as he had after the dance. I find, he said, in the measured way he had when he was working toward something, that I would like to do this again. I would too, she said. He looked at her for a moment, fully. In the Sunday afternoon light that was warm and clear and left nothing to the uncertain interpretation of lanterns or windows. Next Sunday, then, he said. Next Sunday, she agreed. He went to his wagon, and she went to her rooms, and Harlow continued about its quiet Sunday business without taking any particular notice. But on Monday morning, Mrs. Drummond said, from behind the counter of the general store where Winifred had gone for a tin of tea, "Lovely day for a walk yesterday. The creek road is very pleasant in spring." And she said it in the way that suggested she had not come to this opinion entirely on her own, and that Harlow, which missed very little, had missed nothing of this either. They walked the following Sunday, and the one after that. By the 4th Sunday, the routine had established itself with the gentle permanence of things that have found their natural place, and she stopped thinking of it as something that was being arranged and began thinking of it simply as Sunday afternoon. He came to the post office on Fridays at 20 minutes to 5. She sorted his mail on Thursdays with the same careful attention she had always given it. The correspondence between them, the small commerce of 2-minute exchanges over a narrow counter, had not changed precisely. It had simply deepened in the way that a path deepens over time, not by the addition of anything, but by the accumulation of the same footsteps, over and over, wearing something true. In June, on a Friday, he came to the counter and collected his mail, and then stood for a moment, looking at the surface between them, as he had in April when he'd asked about the Sunday walk. "There is something I want to say," he began, "and I want to say it correctly." He stopped. She waited. She had learned how to wait for him. "I have been a man who lives by himself well enough," he said, "and I thought I had made my peace with that. I was perhaps wrong about that. Or rather," he paused again, "I think the peace I had made was with a thing I thought was permanent that turns out to not be permanent, if you understand me." "I think I do," she said. "I'm not a man who has words easily," he said. "You know this about me by now." "I do, but I have." He turned his hat in his hands once, the way he did when he was standing in the doorway. "I have come to care very much about your Fridays," he said quietly, "and your Sundays, and whether your cold has improved, and whether your brother will write." A pause. "And whether you are happy in Harlow." The post office was empty, except for the two of them, and the light through the west window was the long gold of a June evening, and the town outside went about its business without urgency. "I am happier than I was," she said. "Considerably." He looked at her. "Miss Colborne," he said carefully. "Winifred." Her name for the first time without the miss. "Jasper," she said. He took a slow breath. Then he said, "I would like to know whether you might be willing to, whether it would be agreeable to you, to allow me to." He stopped, and something in his face broke slightly toward the rueful, aware of his own difficulty with this. I am doing this very poorly. You are doing it honestly, she said. I prefer that. He looked at her directly. Will you allow me to court you properly? The June light held the room in its warmth. Out on the street, a wagon passed, and two women on the walk exchanged a word, and a child ran by with the uncomplicated urgency of summer. Yes, she said, I will. He held his hat. She held the counter. They looked at each other across its narrow width, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because nothing else was required. He came back on Saturday. She hadn't expected him, with a cutting from a rosebush wrapped in burlap. He handed it over the counter and said only, It was Constance's. It needs a south-facing wall. I thought you might have one. She did. The south wall of the hardware building, below her window, which caught the afternoon light until the sun went behind the grain elevators. She planted it that evening, working the soil carefully with the small spade she had bought in the spring, with some vague notion of a kitchen garden. She did not know exactly what the roses would be. Red, she thought, from the look of the cutting, though it was too early to know. She would have to wait for summer to find out. She found she didn't mind that. She had gotten better at waiting for things to reveal themselves in their own time. By the following summer, the cutting had taken hold and put out 7 roses, a deep and certain red, against the south wall of the hardware building, and the women of Harlow walked past them and remarked upon them, and Mrs. Drummond told anyone who asked that they had been a gift, and left the particular significance of this to be understood in whatever way a person chose to understand it. Jasper Holt still came to the post office at 20 minutes to 5 on Fridays. He still removed his hat at the door. He still stood for a moment in the entrance before approaching the counter. But now, when he did, she was already looking up.